Welcome to Inside Independent Publishing with IBPA. I'm your host, Christopher Locke. I'm also the IBPA Director of Membership and Member Services. Okay, so to get as much attention on your books as possible, it's important for independent publishers and author publishers to connect with audiences outside their network. Alliance of Independent Authors Campaigns Manager Matty Dalrymple joins the podcast today to share expert advice about how to land interviews on podcasts, blog sites, and with reviewers, including whether to pitch yourself or hire a publicist, how to best craft your pitch, how to promote your interview to get the most out of it, and much more. Welcome, Matty. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's fun to chat with you.
Of course, yeah. And so you're both the campaigns manager for ALLi, and you're also an author publisher. So when we're talking about these subjects, we'll really be covering both because you actually publish books too.
Yes, that's right. I'm being able to talk from personal experience from both sides of the mic, so to speak, in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, and I'm also an author publisher, but I work at IBPA. So I do love that aspect of our members, just like with your members, we're able to talk from experience and go, yes, I know how hard it is, and here's how you solve this thing.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So the hot way to get publicity that people like is podcasts right now. So I want to start there. And I wanted to start with just the main concept of when you're looking for some type of podcast, how is there some list somewhere? Because there's so many. I mean, we're literally talking on a podcast now. How is there an easy way for author publishers or publishers to find a podcast that fits their genre, their books?
Well, certainly Google search is probably your friend, or a search on a podcast app. And as you say, you're going to find entries in pretty much every niche, from very general to very, very specific. And as with all of these examples, I'm talking about publicity that you can get, promotion you can get from people who are accepting pitches from individuals and who aren't charging for it. So that's kind of the overarching theme of what we're doing here. But my advice, regardless of the kind of promotion someone's pursuing, podcasts, even blogs and reviews, is go first for the platforms that you enjoy. So if you're pitching podcasts, pitching yourself as a guest to podcasts, then I always recommend that it's important to be a consumer of podcasts as a listener, because you'll not only know podcasts personally that will probably be a good match for you, but you'll kind of understand the gestalt. I think that there's a different gestalt around any kind of communication. And if you're consuming it, you kind of know that naturally. Whereas if you're not consuming it yourself, you have to make a study of it, and that can be tedious, time consuming, and sometimes error prone. So I would say become a listener of podcasts, and then focus on the ones that accept guests. That's an important criteria. The ones that accept guests that seem to be the closest match for your niche.
Yeah. And one of the great things about being familiar with a podcast is that when you're pitching, it'll be natural to understand what topics they normally cover. Because I know even for this one, the IBPA podcast, I get people all the time like, hey, I want to talk about my book or whatever. I got a new book out. And I'm like, well, that's actually not what we do on this podcast. So immediately okay, this person, but they'll start the email with, you're the most amazing podcast ever. I love it. And then you're like, yeah, don't listen. Okay, I wanted to see about when people are trying to land an interview on a podcast, is it possible or do you have a better chance of getting an interview if you have a publicist, or can you really just do it on your own?
Well, I think that based on my own experience as a host, I think there's a real benefit to people doing it themselves, at least to begin with. What you're getting if you hire a pro is that you are spending more money than time, and so that could be a great benefit for people who are holding down a day job and trying to promote their book, on the weekends and the evenings. They don't have a lot of time to do this research we're talking about. You're benefiting from the pros' connections. I mean, they might be bringing an audience with them. They have the connections among the podcasting group. If we're talking about, like a publicity firm or something like that, they've already formed connections, and hopefully they're good connections. Not necessarily, but hopefully. I think that engaging something like a PR firm to look for podcast placements can be good in time-specific situations. Like if you want to do a blitz around a book launch, that can be good because a lot of those organizations, that's what they focus on, supporting a launch. And so they're going to get you a bunch of podcast placements in, a short period of time. But I think the key thing that you lose if you go through a third party like a PR firm is you lose that personal connection. And I actually set a higher bar for potential guests if they're pitched by a PR firm than if they're pitching themselves, because it's very hard for me to get a sense of what are they like, are they somebody that's going to be easy to work with, all those things that can really smooth the way to a great interview. I'm losing that if it's being done by a third party. If you're doing it yourself, you're investing time rather than money, and I don't want to discount that because we should all assign a value to our time. It's just, it's another consideration. People have to be willing to wear a different hat. You have to be willing to promote yourself. I sort of liken it to when you're writing your own resume. You have to be tooting your own horn about, how great you would be for this job match. You have to do the same thing if you're pitching yourself to podcasts. I think it can actually be better if you're looking for placements over time. Like, I'm not a big focus on the launch kind of person. I'm more the long game strategy. And so if I'm spacing my interviews out on based on like one of my nonfiction book topics, for example, that's better for me. And then you need to be doing the research. Like if you're hiring a pro, you need to be doing the research into the pro. If you're doing it yourself, you need to be doing the research into the platforms you're pitching yourself. And the last note I'll add about hiring a pro is be very cognizant of what you're getting, because some PR firms will base their contract with you on how many podcast placements they get you. And so they're incentivized to get you on any podcast, not necessarily incentivized to get you on the ones that are very appropriate to you and your topic and your niche and your preferences. So, that could be fine, but you just have to realize that going in if you are working with someone else.
Sure. Yeah. So if you're doing it on your own, who are you reaching out to? How do you find a person at a podcast to pitch them?
Well, a lot of times podcasts will have contact forms. Um, Also, do research to see whether or not they're accepting pitches. Like some podcasts, and the Indie Author at the moment is one of these podcasts. Some podcasts that do interview guests don't always accept pitches. So I'm in a period of time when I'm not accepting pitches right now. Oftentimes, you can find their contact information on their websites. Of course, the best way to do it is within your community. And so I am always a big proponent of the benefits of writers building out their community and putting the word out there that you're looking for these kinds of opportunities, and also keeping an ear out for other people who are looking for those kinds of opportunities. So it's a mutually beneficial situation. I mean, a perfect example of this is I just got a pitch from someone. It was a crime writer. It was actually a PR company for a crime writer who was doing one of these. My client has a new book out. Can you interview him for the Indie Author podcast? And I said, no, but I'm a member of a crime fiction writers group, and this person might actually be a really good speaker for that. And so I'm forwarding that information on to someone else. And so just keeping aware of what other people are looking for and how you can help them out, that always brings good karma back. And you can even ask, like, once you start getting placements, you can either sort of thoughtfully ask the podcaster if they have any suggestions. If somebody came on the Indie Author podcast and at the end of the conversation, they said, "Oh, I'm really looking, to reach an audience of writers who are interested in the business side of the publishing world. Do you have any suggestions?" I would be like, "Oh, you know what? I do. IBPA and ALLi would be great matches for that." And so it's a very collegial community. And so you can even ask podcasters for those kinds of recommendations.
Sure, absolutely. And so, we're talking about pitching. So what are you in your email, like, what's your subject line? Like, what are the things that you need to include to show them that, yes, you should be the exact guest that they need on their podcast?
Well, I have sort of a little formula that people can use. And this is based on the pitches that I've gotten. I said, Yes, that's it's a great match. And so, one is to demonstrate your familiarity with their podcast, and do it truthfully and genuinely. You know, sometimes I'll get pitches that say, "I've been listening to the Indie Author podcast, and I just listened to your interview with so and so on the such and such topic, and I was especially interested in this particular comment that you or the guest made." Perfect. Illustrating that they, even if that's the only episode they ever listened to, they're demonstrating that they spent the time and effort to research that. If the if that connection that you can mention is related to your topic, it's all the better. Because if you can send a pitch that says, "I listened to your conversation about how to pitch podcasters, and I think I have a great companion topic that would be how to pitch book reviewers, that would be a great follow-on," then that's great too. You've led them into from your experience with their platform to what you have to offer. I think that this topic would be great for your listeners because, illustrate that you understand the value that the podcaster is trying to provide to their listeners, and be very explicit about how the topic that you're pitching can meet that need. And in general, make it super, I would say keep it short, but use links to your advantage, and make it super simple for the podcaster. So don't ask them to do any homework in order to find out more about you. Here's a link to my website. Here's a link to a video from a recent writers group where I was talking on this topic. Here are links to my books. Make sure you have, here's a link to my bio, here's a link to my headshot, should we go forward with this. So make it super easy for them to get all the information they need in order to make an assessment of whether you're a good match or not.
So
And then
don't say, "Hey, if you solve this riddle, then you're allowed to have me as a guest on the podcast."
Exactly.
Don't do that. Okay.
I am very surprised how many authors send me a pitch and they don't include a link to their website. And sometimes I'll go and look for it, and I'm like, "You do have a website. It would be good to have a link to it."
Yeah.
And the other piece of advice I'd offer is maybe offer a couple of alternatives. And so, in general, I love talking about podcasting for authors. But I have a couple of subtopics I can address. So I can talk about pitching yourself as a guest. I can talk about the tech side of podcasting. I can talk about podcasting as content marketing for other materials. I have 3 or 4 or 5 topics, so that if someone says, "Well, the general topic sounds good, but we just talked to somebody about pitching themselves as a guest," I'm like, "Oh, well, here are the 3 other bulleted things that are related that I could also talk about." So, being personal, making it easy for them, and giving them alternatives, I think are the formula for a successful pitch.
Yeah, absolutely. So once the podcast is live, as the person who was interviewed, what should you do to help get the word out about this podcast?
Well, one is to make sure that you know when the podcast goes up. Now, this is more like a piece of advice to the podcasters than the podcastees, but you hope that your podcaster tells you when the the episode goes up. This I found is not always the case, and so if you've done an interview with a podcast, it's probably a good idea just to put a tickler list on your calendar that says, if the podcaster says that, this should be up in a couple of weeks or in a month or on Thursday or whatever, just have a tickler list that you go back and check just in case they forget to let you know. And once you've done that, then promote. So you do want this to be a mutually beneficial relationship. You are hoping to reach more people by tapping into your podcaster's or your host's audience. And the podcaster also has an expectation that you're going to help spread the word about their platform with your own followers. And this is true whether you have 10 followers or 10,000 followers. You should be doing exactly the same thing. If you have 3 people on your email list, then you need to email those 3 people about your podcast appearance. My policy currently, I am backing off a bit of my activity on social media, but I continue to remain more interactive on one platform, that's Facebook. And then I use a social media posting tool to get word out on the other platforms, although I don't make any commitment that I'm going to be interacting with users there. but publish information everywhere that you have an account where you have reach into. Make sure to include links. Be sure, to the extent you can, this is more difficult with a social media posting tool, but make sure that you flag the person in the post so they realize that you're doing it. Or if that's not possible, like it is difficult to include, to reliably include flags if you're using a social media posting tool, maybe just drop them a note saying, "Oh, thanks. I see my episode is up. I've posted it on all these platforms so that they get the information that way." And just be a good corporate citizen to discharge your side of the commitment. And of course, you pursued this for your own selfish purposes too, getting word out about your work. And so, don't don't undermine the benefits by being secretive about it.
Yeah, sure. And then what are the ways that you can repurpose the interview beyond just posting, "Hey, this was an interview. Thank you. It's a great interview. You should listen."
Yeah, well, depending on your technical expertise and the agreement you have with your host, one thing I would say is assess to the extent to which the content is evergreen. So, as an example, I make a point in the Indie Author podcast to generally not focus on anything that's too time bound. 99% of my content on the Indie Author podcast is evergreen. And so a guest could go back to an episode that was months, years old and repost it. And again, a tickler list is great. Say, here are the podcasts or the other platforms that I've made appearances on. This is maybe the frequency at which it makes sense to repeat it. This is how long, assess it. Does it still make sense? Has there been some change in the environment that makes it not make sense anymore? And yeah, keep returning to it. And all these things that you can do to make the most of the content is so important, because it pains me when I see authors who go to all the trouble to research the podcast and listen to the podcast and write their pitch and personalize it and send it to the podcaster and go through, prep for the interview, do the interview, and then they don't do anything more with it. That's painful. You're not taking advantage of the best and easiest part of the process, unless you're doing that kind of repurposing. And then for people who have more, audio and video editing experience, get permission from your podcast host to say, can I download this? Can I make audiograms of it? Can I excerpt clips from it? I don't know of any podcast host that would object to that, as long as the material you send out points people back to the source material.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the blogs. So podcasts are the hot thing now. People used to talk about blogs all the time. So are blogs even something that people still read? Is it still worth pitching?
I think this really goes back to, is it something that you consume yourself?
Mm.
I'm not a big blog reader. I don't do a blog myself. There was a time when I did. I stopped doing it because I felt like I only had so many words in me per day, and I wanted to be spending them on my books.
Mhm.
But if you love blogs, then definitely go for blogs. Again, it's this case that you understand what people are looking for, you understand the gestalt, and you probably have a group of blogs that you enjoy as a reader that you can pitch. All those same guidelines that I described about pitching podcasts apply here. And here I'm thinking of when you are pitching yourself as a guest blogger to another person who has a blog that they accept guest posts for. Oftentimes, writers groups can be great sources of this, especially if they're genre specific writers groups. The more specific to a topic you can find, the closer a match you can find, the more likely it is that you're really going to see impact from sharing that information out. If you're, some people are not I only have so many words in me a day. Some people are like, I have more words than I can, I'm ever going to be able to use in my book. And so writing a blog for those people could be a really great kind of palate cleanser for your work, a way of thinking through things that you want to process. My personal feeling is that podcasts, because of their on-the-go nature, have in some cases taken away some of the audience that used to be going to blogs. But what you want to find is not necessarily the biggest audience. You want to find the most engaged audience. And so blogs can certainly be an option for that.
Well, there's a term blog tour. So can you talk about, what is a blog tour? How do you set one up?
Well, a blog tour would be similar to the to scheduling podcast episodes around a book launch. I think most people do blog tours around a around a book launch. And so it would again either be finding a service that offers this and doing your due diligence to make sure that they're a reputable service, or contacting the people that host blogs regularly. And again, Google search is your friend after you've exhausted the ones that you know personally. You could just put in a blog tour or blogs that accept guest posts in a certain genre and get in touch with them yourself. I think that the tricky thing, and this is an interesting distinction that I haven't totally thought through myself, but I generally don't. I deprioritize people who are looking for guest appearances on a podcast around a book launch, because I know that they're going to be pitching all the other podcasts that are in my genre. And as a listener, I don't like it if I'm listening to podcast A and I hear this guest talking about a topic, and then I go to podcast B and it's the same person talking about kind of the same thing. Um, I like it better when it's not all grouped together like that, because if you're podcast C and people tune in, they say, oh, well, I've already heard this person talking about this like 3 days ago. That's not so much fun. I think that if you do that, then as a guest, you have a responsibility to bring a slightly different spin to each of those appearances, which I find much easier to do in an interview format, because the questions that the interviewer asks is going to drive the conversation. And so I might be talking about getting the gig with podcasters today, and I might be talking about it with another interviewer next week, but the conversation is going to be quite different because of the questions that are asked. Whereas blog tours, I think you still have the responsibility to provide something slightly different in each of your guest blog posts. And again, I don't want to be coloring my attitude about this based on my own preference, but I think that's harder to do in the blog format than in the podcast format. So that's just something to consider if you feel like, oh, my topic is, structuring your novel, and I have 10 different ways I can talk about it, then that could be perfect for you. It's an opportunity to get all 10 of those ways out to the audience you want to reach.
For structuring my novels, I just like do it well. I'm like, this is all my only goal, do it well.
That would be a very short blog post, but probably very effective.
Yeah, that's the only one line. Just do it well.
Just do it well.
So reviewers, and by the way, when we're talking about this, we're not talking about trade reviews like Publishers Weekly and Kirkus Reviews. These are individuals who do reviews. So can you just tell us, and how does this differ from a blog, like these reviewers? But then, is this worthwhile for people to try to pitch reviewers?
Yeah, the reviewers, again, we're sticking with the same theme of these are people who accept individual pitches and they don't charge for it. I am not a book reviewer myself. This is one of the areas of our conversation where I only have the experience on the author side, not the reviewer side. But I had a great conversation with Christopher Zgorski, who is the person behind Bolo Books for the Indie Author podcast, and it was funny because it was best practices for pitching book reviewers. And like every time Christopher said something, I was like, oh yeah, the same for podcasts. So again, a lot of the information is the same in terms of making it personal. I think that, well, actually for all of these, one thing to consider is how far out is the person's horizon for scheduling. So for example, for the Indie Author podcast, I'm generally like 4 or 5 weeks out. I can make certain adjustments, like if someone is really hoping to have a podcast interview go out around their book launch date, I'll do my best, but I can't always guarantee it. I think that the same is probably true of blog tours. For reviewers, you have to consider, well, again, for all of them, I guess, do they want to publicize your book before or after launch? So Bolo Books, be on the lookout. By definition, Chris is posting reviews of books that have not yet published. And he is a very popular reviewer in the crime fiction market. And so he has a long, long list of books on his queue to read, setting aside the long, long queue of books that people want him to read. And so you have to be willing, for example, to say, well, I know my book's coming out in 6 months, so I'm going to send it to Chris now. Like for my books, I would love to have Chris review my books, but normally I don't have a 6-month lead time. Only with one book have I ever been able to send it out and say, this isn't publishing until far enough out that it would make sense for this reviewer. So I think that the scheduling side of it can be a little more challenging with book reviewers. One of the things that Chris said, and again, this applies to all of them, is that because he has this huge influx of requests and he's going through and he's picking out what the next book is he wants to read, that recognizing the name helps. And he could recognize the name by seeing that it's someone who has shared his social media post or commented on his social media posts or, gets his newsletter and has replied with a nice comment about it. So paving the way with any of these promoters by supporting them in advance of your request can be a great tip. There's also sort of the flavor of does money exchange hands? In the scenario we're talking about, money does not change hands. These are reviewers who do it for free. But also be aware that you cannot ask the reviewer to buy your book. You have to be willing to send the reviewer the book. These people are doing this largely as a labor of love. And, let's not ask them to fork out some money in order to have the honor of reading your book. So be prepared to send it to them. Many of them accept it in electronic form, which is great. If they want to see an art copy, then you need to be able to be prepared to accommodate that. Again, make it as easy as possible for them to help spread the word about your book.
Yeah, unbeknownst to IBPA, every guest on this podcast, I make them pay me through my Venmo account. So anyway, I'll be texting you about that. So okay, so with trade reviews, sometimes if they have a negative review, you have the option of them not posting it. If these reviewers, is there a chance that they will review your book and be like, yep, it was terrible? Or do they sometimes allow you to say, oh my gosh, you didn't like it? Never mind.
Yes, that's another great thing to research. Christopher Zgorski, for example, will only publish a positive review. That is not true for everybody, and so you have to do your research. When in doubt, ask, and weigh the benefits. If you're not paying them any money, then I think that that lowers one barrier. I'm thinking of Kirkus Reviews, Kirkus Reviews, which is not what we're talking about because that is a review you pay for and you pay a lot of money. And then, you might get them saying, I hated this book. And then you're not going to get your money back. The only thing you can do is say, okay, please don't publish that review. Because these people are just doing it largely as a volunteer basis. This is not a business. You usually don't have that kind of, option necessarily. And so just understand ahead of time what the rules of the game are. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about a few different options. I mean, as we mentioned, you're an author publisher, so I'm interested, and you can, beyond just the ones we talked about, what's been successful for you, and whatever the word success means to you, did it get you book sales? Did it get you a lot of exposure? So, podcasts, blog posts, reviewers, or any other option?
Well, maybe not surprisingly, the thing that's been most successful for me is podcasting, both on both sides of the mic. So I can trace so many of the things that have been successful in my author career back to the relationships I've built among the writing and publishing community. And so many of those have some background in either people I've interviewed for my podcast or people who have interviewed me for their podcast. As with so many parts of the independent publishing world, it's a much more supportive than a competitive environment, and so people are willing to help each other out in ways that would be unheard of in any other industry. One of the ways that I found it's benefited me most is not necessarily in book sales, but in other opportunities like content marketing. Podcasting can be an extraordinarily powerful content marketing tool. And for me, the what I've content marketed through my podcast is speaking engagements. And so I've probably made more from speaking engagements on, let's say, podcasting for authors than I have selling my book, Podcasting for Authors. But I needed the book in order to get the podcast placements that enabled me to land the speaking engagements. So I think if you can look at it in that more holistic way, especially if you have other things beyond your books to offer, like consulting or coaching or speaking engagements or merch or whatever that might be, then being able to talk about those things with people through a podcast or through a blog post is great. Book reviews, to loop back to those a little bit, I think that the one downside of book reviews is one, that you have less control over what the output is, but second, that you're advertising the book, but you're not advertising yourself. Like, I think that somebody who reads a book review is going to decide that they want to read that book or not read that book, but I don't think they're going to necessarily feel like they have a connection or not have a connection with the author. Whereas I think, especially podcasts, but also blog posts, you have an opportunity to market yourself and your book, which is a great thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. And if you're building some type of relationship with your audience and, people that, they're like, oh, I like that person, they were fun, they're more likely to check out your books in the future, 100%.
Yeah.
And if anyone's wondering, I do sell merch. You can buy this shirt. So
that very shirt?
No, this one, yes. I'm selling it for $100,000 after this episode. No, I don't have anything. Okay, so I do really make sure that we want to talk about ALLi and IBPA. So we partner, as associations, we have some of the same similar audience. So for example, on the IBPA site, we have a writer's resource center, and it has a lot of, you all have great resources for writers and authors. And so we have that on there. It's under our resources tab. And also anyone who's an ALLi member gets $30 off of IBPA membership. So if you go onto, I know, very exciting. If you go on the ALLi website, if you're a member, then you can see that, or you can reach out to us and we'll tell you more about it. Okay, so tell us, you're the campaigns manager for ALLi. So what type of work do you do over at ALLi?
Well, as the campaigns manager, I'm responsible for the campaigns from the ALLi point of view. There are 4 ongoing campaigns that ALLi focuses on. One is self-publishing for all. So that is efforts to open up, make self-publishing available to people, whether that's through educating them about the processes, about offering advice or resources to get around financial limitations, physical limitations, geographical limitations, whatever that might be, giving people all the resources they need in order to independently publish successfully. We have another one called Open Up to Indie Authors. So this is a campaign that's focused more on the organizers and the sponsors of things like contests and grants and events. We focus on those that historically have been open only to traditionally published authors, and we encourage them to open up their offerings to indie authors as well. We have one called Publishing for Profit. That's a very popular one. It's basically giving people the information they need in order to understand that independent publishing is a business and needs to be treated as such, and giving them the tools in order to make sound business decisions, assess their strategic goals, come up with tactics that match them in order to achieve profitability. And then the 4th campaign is ethical self-publishing. ALLi's whole mission is around ethics and excellence in self-publishing. And so we have a whole campaign focused on how people can do that ethically, how can they behave ethically themselves, and then how can they assess potential partners for ethical behavior as well. The ethics in self-publishing, a big emphasis this year was on AI, as you can imagine, and helping people think through the ethical considerations. ALLi definitely takes an AI curious position, and we encourage others to do that as well. Within AI, we've been focusing on the issues of clarity, having AI developers be clear about how they're training their models, getting approval from the creators of the material they're using to do that, compensating those creators appropriately for the use of that material. And then the fourth sort of pillar of our AI position is curiosity, encouraging authors to be curious about AI, understand what is involved, and then make informed decisions about to what extent, if at all, they want to use that in their own creative work and in their own business work. I think that increasingly people are recognizing that an author can make one decision about their creative work. They may decide they never want to use any kind of generative AI for their creative work. But hey, if it can help with the back office tasks, then that's something that more people are feeling comfortable with. And specific to some of what we've been talking about, like book tours and things like that, ALLi also offers resources to help people find ethical partners. So we do have an ALLi Partners program, which is a vetted group of service providers. I myself am an ALLi partner, as well as the ALLi Campaigns Manager, because I offer consulting services. I'm vetted by ALLi as a recommended resource for members there. And then we also have publicly available ratings and reviews of awards and services. So if anyone were to just Google ALLi award ratings or ALLi service ratings, they would be able to find and access that information on vetted service providers.
Yeah, 100%. So something I always tell people is, like sometimes people will get just emails from companies and they'll be like, your book seems amazing. We're going to help you sell it. We're going to take it to Frankfurt. It'll be $5,000. Don't worry, just give us some money. And you'd be surprised how many people don't do the research to
Yeah.
see if these are like legit.
Yeah.
And or if it's like a good service. So maybe they will take your book to the Frankfurt Book Fair, but it's just on some shelf. They're not trying to sell it. They don't do anything. So please ask before you give anyone money. Ask around. Look at ALLi's list. Connect with IBPA members, whoever you're in connection with, because it breaks my heart when people lose money because they just didn't do the research. So I'm glad you all have those resources for them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that any kind of creator is especially susceptible to those kinds of things because we put our heart and soul into the things we write, and then we want to get them into that work into the hands of readers. And it's not like making a widget; it's the work of our heart. And so it's, I think, easier for bad players to take advantage of people of authors if they don't do that kind of work.
Yeah. So, Matty, this was excellent. This was great information. I really appreciate it. I want to make sure people go to all the different sites. So make sure to check out your books at mattydalrymple.com. So mattydalrymple.com.
Yeah.
And then you also, if you mentioned, the nonfiction platform, the indieauthor.com. So check that out. And also, as I said, ALLi and IBPA do a lot of work together. You should definitely check out ALLi. That you all have a great website, selfpublishingadvice.org. You have the author awards contest reviews, like you mentioned, and then the best self-publishing services. So definitely check those out. And then IBPA, we have, for example, we've talked about how to get, a podcast interview or some type of, mention in an article. Well, we have a media outreach program, and it goes out to 3,000 journalists, book reviewers, editors, bloggers. So you were talking about that concept of, hiring someone. It can get kind of costly if you hire someone individually, but with IBPA, it's not all that costly, and we just send it out to all these people, and then they will respond to you and say, your book sounds great. I did it myself, and I was really happy with the results. So I definitely check that out. If you want to learn more about IBPA, go to ibpa-online.org. Again, Matty, really appreciate you for being here. Appreciate the partnership we have with ALLi. And also, best of luck with your own books. I love, again, that you're doing what you're also talking about. So the ins and outs of everything.
No, well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's always lovely to chat with you, Christopher.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and check out the podcast the last Thursday of every month on YouTube, and then also wherever you download podcasts. Have a great day, everyone.